Hello, and thank you for watching Chess Lover's channel. In today's video clip, I'm going to talk about pawn structures. And one of the best books, if not the best, I think is this one, Winning Pawn Structures, the Isolated Queen's Pawn and its Derivatives. It's written by the Russian-Irish Grandmaster Alexander Baburin. Alexander Baburin, he was born in Gorky, 1967, but moved to Ireland 1993. For the moment, I believe he's a coach teaching school children, and is also an active player. He has played games from 1985 until today. I had the pleasure of meeting Baburin in the Grandmaster tournament in 2009. It was played in Täby outside Stockholm, Scandinavian chess tournament, and he really taught me a lesson regarding pawn structures, because in our game I played against the isolani, and he certainly proved he understood more about everything connected to the isolated queen pawn. So he had an isolated queen pawn on d5, and an isolated pawn means there are no neighboring pawns on the c or e file, and I blockaded the pawn on d4 with my queen, but he put his minor pieces on precisely the right squares, because in one position I let him develop his so-called bad bishop on c8 to f5, where it could exploit this diagonal from h7 to b1, because I didn't play bishop d3. I was eager in this game and played to win the isolated queen's pawn, and that is not so easy. So he certainly taught me a lesson. So when I understood I couldn't win the isolated queen's pawn, I went for a draw, and I even offered him a draw when the position was about equal, but he had some slight pressure on me, and in one position I misevaluated an ending, so he managed to beat me in a pawn ending, because I had an isolated pawn on h3, because early in the game he managed to activate his bishop on f5 and put it on e4, and then bishop takes f3 took place, because I didn't have a bishop on e2, so I had to weaken my king side with g takes f3. So it's a superb game. It taught me very much about this particular pawn structure, but also pawn formations, because he managed to weaken my pawn structure on the king side. And I also exchanged my light squared bishop on a2 when he at a later moment pushed his isolated queen pawn to d4. I played bishop takes e6 where he had a knight, and he recaptured with f takes e6. So the pawn structure was changed again. But I could certainly see how deep knowledge he had of pawn structures as well as pawn formations in this game. He controlled every aspect of the pawn skeleton. So he's certainly the right man to read this book about isolated pawn. However, one book I can recommend before you read this book is My System by Aron Nimzowitsch, because there he really discussed the fundamental matters, both the dynamic strength of the isolated pawn and the static weakness. So generally speaking, you can say that if there are many pieces on the board, as it is in the opening and in the middle game, it's normally a strong pawn because it has dynamic strength. But in the end game, it normally gets weaker, so the static weakness becomes more apparent for every piece exchange that takes place, especially if black now has the isolated pawn on d5, hasn't got rid of his bishop on c8, his light-squared bishop. Generally speaking, you can also say that if you want to hold the draw in an ending where the isolated queen's pawn is normally a weakness, you should have minor pieces on the board rather than major pieces. I shall discuss the main structure in this book, because all the different chapters tell us something important we need to know about the isolated queen's pawn. But we will have the perspective that white has an isolated pawn on d4. So this book is split in 3 parts, and part 1 discusses the advantages of the isolated d-pawn. So first he has some general considerations, and then chapter 1 begins with white advances d4 to d5. And this was what happened in my game against Baburin, because he played d5 to d4. And in chapter 2, he discusses attack on the f7 square. In chapter 3, kingside attack, especially the rook lift. It can be, for example, pawn e3 to h3 or to g3. Chapter 4, the bishop sacrifice on h6 and the queen shift. Chapter 5, the h-pawn battering ram. Chapter 6, queenside activity and play on the c-file. Chapter 7, play on the c-file. Exercises for part 1. So this is the first part of the book, which discusses the benefits of having an isolated queen's pawn. Part 2, disadvantages of the isolated d-pawn. Chapter 8, the weak isolani in the endgame. So here he's also discussing multi-piece endings. Chapter 8 is split into the following parts: king and pawn endings, bishop endings, endings with bishop and knights, rook endings, queens and rooks, rook and minor piece endings. And I'm especially interested in the chapter rook and minor piece endings, because I think this is a neglected area that many chess players don't study well enough. So I'm going to show you a position that arose in the game between Laszlo Slabo, the Hungarian grandmaster, and Payne Roos, a British chess player. And this game took place in the European Team Championship 1973. And here you can see a typical position that arose in that game. So we have one rook each and one light square bishop each. And here Sabo suggests a 3-step plan. By the way, I should show you this book where I have found this example. So it's a book, My Best Games of El Sabo. So what is writing here is that the three-step plan means that white should put his king on d4 and maneuver the bishop to f3. Yeah, you can see the position again. And then try to create a second weakness on the king side by moving forward the pawns. f4, f5, followed by g4, h4, g5. So this is a typical plan in this position. I was very impressed of Szabo's play in this game because earlier in the game he could play bishop e2 to f3 and block his f2 pawn, a move I think many players would have chosen. But he played bishop d3 because then he covers a possible intrusion square on c2 from black rook, as well as preparing f4, f5. And Szabo says in his comment that it's no hurry to play bishop e2 to f3. So according to him, it was better to harass black a little bit with this threat of f4 to f5. So I think this is a very good model game. However, later in this game, black put his king on b7. I show you the position here. And according to Raymond Keane, who is one of the authors to this book, Team Championship, in Bath, 1973. So according to him, king b7 is a mistake here because the king is cut off. Instead, I should have put the king on d6. And such questions are very interesting to answer because when you're dealing with isolated pawn, it's very much a matter of where the pieces should be placed. I mean, we know the white king should be placed on d4, the white bishop on f3, and the rook on the second rank, c2, and at the right moment, it will shift to the king side to support the pawn storm. But where should black pieces be placed? Should the king protect the so-called reflex weaknesses on the queen side, or should the king be placed on d6? And interestingly, Szabo don't even discuss this question. And I checked another book from another famous chess trainer, Grivas. He has also written a part about the isolated pawn in this book. And he also discusses his model game, but he mentions nothing when black plays king b7. So here we see the value of having a chess library, because chess authors write different things about the same game. And in my opinion, chess books are superior to computers because it doesn't matter what the computers say. What is important here is what humans say. So for Keane, this is maybe the decisive mistake, but for Grivas and Szabo, and Szabo was involved in this game because he had the white pieces and he annotated the game and he was very proud of it, as it's regarded as one of his best games. He did not even mention the possibility of king d6, presumably because he regarded the queen side pawn as potential positional weaknesses. And in this game, in this book, you cannot find this game between Szabo and Penrose. Instead, you can find another game between Larsen and Penrose, which is actually a similar ending. I can show you the positions. So we are still talking about rook and minor piece endings, focusing on the isolated pawn. And it's 128 in this book. By the way, I should mention that this book was published 1998, and then it was published again in 2000 as well as 2001. So it is a very popular book. Okay, we continue with chapter 9, which discusses, the headline is the weak isolani in the middle game, position with bishops, opposite colored bishops, position with knights, knight versus bishop middle games. Chapter 10, combating the isolani by simplification, exercises for part 2. Part 3, associated pawn structures. Chapter 11, transformation of the pawn skeleton. Chapter 12, hanging pawns and the isolated pawn couple. Exercises for part 3. So just like Nimzowitsch does in his My System, Baburin also discusses the isolated pawn couple, which means you have pawns on c3 and d4. So black has probably taken a knight on c3, and white has taken back with the b pawn. And if this c pawn is pushed to c4, then we have the hanging pawns. So these structures belong in the same family, according to Nimzowitsch, the so-called family tree. So that is why I'm recommending you, if you want to learn more about the isolani, we're talking about the isolated pawn, the queen's pawn on d4, then My System, the second part of that book, is very useful reading before you concentrate on this book, which really explores the isolated pawn in depth. And as I said before, I have personal acquaintance of playing a game against Baburin, and he really showed me how skilled he is when it's about pawn structure as well as pawn formations. I have already recommended another book if you want to study pawn formations, like for example pawn duos, pawn trios. So with pawn formations, we are also focused on pawn structures that are not located in the central area of the board. So in my game against Baburin, I got an isolated pawn on h3 and a double pawn on f2 and f3. And he managed to exploit this fact in a pawn ending by essentially changing the pawn formation so he got an outside passed pawn on the king side. So that was very skillful treatment of pawn structures. And due to the fact that I have really suffered because I didn't know these subtleties good enough for grandmaster level at least, this game was really a lesson. So that is the reason I'm recommending this book, because he really knows what he's talking about. I think this is the only book he has published. So nowadays he's publishing email distributed chess news magazine called Chess Today, and if you want, it's possible to subscribe it for free. So he's mainly teaching school children today on Zoom. So he's giving lessons, but he's also an active player. So I believe he's also a very interesting player to study if you want to delve deeper in the intricacies of pawn structures. So by studying especially the isolated pawn, you will, with the help of analogy, also be able to use this knowledge in other structures, not only isolated pawn couple and hanging pawns. Because to exploit an isolated pawn in the middle of the board, you must always answer the fundamental question, should I try to win the pawn, as Karpov like to do, or should I blockade it, as Nimzowitsch like to do? So this is a fundamental question to answer. And in my game, I failed, because when I played Baburin, I first tried to win the isolated pawn, but by using the inherent dynamic strength of the isolated pawn and activate his pieces on the right places, he refuted this plan, because at one moment I couldn't play queen takes d5 because he could play knight d3 check, and I couldn't take the knight with the rook because then he had bishop takes d3, and it didn't help. I had a bishop on c4 because he had pressure on the d file with the queen and the rook, so I would lose material. So when I realized that, I withdrew and blockaded the pawn instead. But this also failed, because later in the game he managed to push the pawn, and eventually he managed to play d takes e3 and secure all the exchanges of the rooks and win the pawn ending, because my h-pawn was weak, and also gave him the chance to change the structure so he could get an outside pass pawn. So that was an excellent lesson to learn. And this is also a reason why you must play chess against hard opposition, because if you only read chess, you have not applied your learning in true combat. So that is very important. Always read good chess books. You can focus on a particular theme, like the isolated pawn, and then you read about the isolated pawn from different books, so you get an objective and more all-round picture. But I strongly recommend that you start with my system, and then you can read other books, like, for example, Chernyshevsky, what has he written about the isolated pawn? What has Dvoretsky and Yusupov written about the isolated pawn? What has Braunstein written about pawn structures in Neuhagen Zürich 1953? So that is why I believe it's important to have a chess library, because then you can focus on a particular theme and learn the most important things around this or that theme. I hope you have enjoyed this clip, and later on I will probably show this game, but for now I have focused on this book written by Alexander Baburin, Winning Pawn Structures, the Isolated Queen's Pawn and its Derivatives.